الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So today inshallah we'll be picking up from where we had stopped in the last session, where we had started introducing Kitab Al-Hayd. So Masahil or matter that relates to menstrual discharge, that the ulama, that they will discuss this within the bab of Tahara, seeing that there's Masahil that relates to this. And as we had mentioned in the previous lesson as a form of introduction, that the discharge from a female either would be of Hayd, which is a monthly cycle that they will have. Second, that will have concerning nifas. This occur after having a child. After having a child, then she'll have this bleeding that occurs after giving birth to a child. And the third would be Istihadah. So Istihadah, it's a discharge, that continuous discharge that she may experience, but it's not Hayd nor nifas. So all of these have different masahil that relates to these different form of discharge or that the woman may experience. So today, inshallah ta'ala, that will mention the hadith that have been mentioned here, or discuss the hadith that are mentioned by the author, the hadith of Aisha anha, and the masahil that relates to it. And we will normally approach these lessons where the hadith will be mentioned. We'll discuss about the hadith, and then we'll discuss the masahil of the hadith. Nam.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Nabi Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Hadith from chapter number 10, Bab al-Hayd. Hadith 118. Narrated A'ishah radiallahu anha, Fatima, bint Abu Hubaish, had a prolonged flow of blood, and the last messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam told her, the menstruation blood is a dark, recognizable blood. So if that comes, then avoid prayer. And if it is the other blood, then perform wudu and offer the prayer. Reported by Abu Dawood and Nasa'i, Ibn Hibban and Al-Hakim graded it as authentic, and Abu Hatim considered it munkar.
So this is the hadith that has been mentioned here by the author. So the hadith that has been mentioned, we said the hadith of, as he stated, and Aisha radiallahu anha قالت إن فاطمة بنت أبي حبيش كانت تستحاض فقال رسول الله عليه السلام إن دم الحيض دم أسود يعرف فإذا كان ذلك فأمسكي عن صلاة فإذا كانت آخر فتودعي وصلي. رواه أبو داود والنسائي وصححه ابن حبان والحاكم واستنكره أبو حاتم. So this is the hadith that has been mentioned by the author Ibn Hajar regarding this discussion that he mentioned here as matters regarding, as some have mentioned concerning that the matter regarding of those ahkam that relates to al-hayd. So of those ahkam that relates to al-hayd, that the author have mentioned this particular hadith. So as for this hadith that have been mentioned, that as we state the hadith, as he states concerned, the first of those things is takhrij of the hadith. So a takhrij of the hadith, trying to identify what have been mentioned by the ulama, and regarding this particular hadith, regarding it being authentic or not. So as for what can be said regarding concern of one of the ulama pertaining to this particular hadith, that Ibn Hajar alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, when he mentioned the hadith, he mentioned rawahu, yani this hadith has been narrated by Abu Dawood, Nasa'i, wasahahu Ibn Hibban, and Ibn Hibban all hadith to be authentic. Also Al-Hakim, then he mentioned wastankarahu Abu Hatim, and that Abu Hatim, that he objected to this hadith, that he had some criticism of this hadith. So as for general takhrij of the hadith, that what have been stated regarding concerning that this hadith is found in Abu Dawood. Also this hadith is found in Nasa'i, Al-Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak, Ibn Hibban in his Sahih, Ad-Daraqutni, Wal-Bayhaqi, also the hadith in the At-Tirmidhi, Ahmed and others. So this particular hadith that they have, so this is the hadith, and the hadith have different asanid that goes with this hadith. So of the one that is mentioned here, that this particular hadith, that as we mentioned before, the hadith in Abu Dawood, also the hadith in the Nasahi, Ibn Hibban wal Hakim, where they mentioned that as for this isnad, that also this hadith have some additional information in the narration of the narration in the Abu Dawood, Nasai, Al-Hakim, where the additional wording of the mention, where they mention concerning that when he mentioned, where the Prophet had mentioned that he state, فَإِنَّمَا هُوَ إِرْقٌ, that this is but something of an irq, a fine of a blood vessel that have been broken. So this particular hadith, they mentioned regarding concerning the isnad of the hadith, that there's some discussion between the ulama regarding this particular hadith that have been mentioned here, by way of one, the sanad, and also second, the matan. So between the ulama, there's a discussion with this hadith regarding the isnad, the sanad, and also second, regarding the matan, the text of the hadith, the wording of the hadith. As for what is mentioned regarding this hadith, that as they state concerning this hadith, that this particular hadith, that of one, that the ulama also discussed regarding this hadith, that regarding that hadith, it goes back way of the matan, the discussion regarding the discussion of the hadith regarding the matan, that in this matan of the hadith, that some, that they mentioned the hadith to be the hadith of Fatima bin Qais. So some narration that the hadith is said to be the hadith of Fatima bin Qais. So you find that which the narrator was Muhammad ibn Abi Adi. So this narrator was Muhammad ibn Abi Adi, that he state, and Muhammad ibn Amr, and Zuhri, and Awra, and Aisha. So this hadith, one of the matan, it ends with the hadith of Aisha, as in this case. Then it mentioned qalat inna Fatima, then she mentioned regarding the matter regarding Al-Fatima. Another narration of this hadith, or another of the turuq, the isnad of this hadith, it mentioned, and Muhammad ibn Abi Adi, and Muhammad ibn Amr, and Zuhri, and Awra, and Fatima. So some narration of the hadith, it goes back to Al-Fatima. So some narration of the hadith goes back to Fatima. So not Aisha, but rather goes straight to Fatima, as being the one who's Fatima bint Hubaish. Fatima bint Hubaish. So another of the turuq of this hadith, another wedge of the hadith mentioned, and Muhammad ibn Adi, Muhammad ibn Abi Adi, and Muhammad ibn Amr, and Zuhri ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and Awra, and Fatima kanat tastahad. So this kind of somewhat, this narration goes mentioned regarding that it ends with Awra, one of the narrators, who's a tabi, that they mentioned. So they mentioned that he was not present. So this hadith considered to be mursal, where he was not present when this incident occurred. So when this incident occurred, that they mentioned that he was not present. Some also mentioned that with Awra, that at times you have narrated a hadith on Aisha, and at times you narrated the hadith on Fatima. So you have narration going both ways. But overall, that as claimed by Ibn Hazm. So you find this hadith is under discussion between the ulama, as we mentioned, one, by way of the isnad. So of the things regarding the sin of the hadith, as we had stated regarding that, is this hadith going back to Fatima? Does the hadith go back to Aisha? And as we mentioned in some narration, it mentioned hadith going back to Awra. So most of the ulama, so you have that discussion between the ulama. So is the hadith from, they said, the musnad of Fatima, or the musnad of Aisha? And as we state that the hadith, it kind of somewhat, it goes back to the narrator, Muhammad ibn Abi Adi. So is that the person that this hadith becomes the madar, that everything goes back, revolves around this particular narrator. Where I mentioned in some narration, he narrated a hadith by way of kitab, is kitab, by way from a book, and other that he memorized, that he mentioned the hadith by way of his hifz. So some narration that when he mentioned the hadith, it was from his memory, and the others with the hadith of Fatima by kitab, and the hadith at times they narrate the hadith by way of his memory. So a discussion between the ulama on this matter, that I mentioned that the more correct version of hadith, that it went from his kitab, not from his memory. So the more they mentioned that the arja, the more correct is that it came from his kitab. But overall, as mentioned, that a discussion between the ulama, Ibn Hazm, that of those who are going to start mentioning to note that it being mentioned in this manner at times by way of him writing the hadith kitaba, or him narrating the hadith by way of his memory, says now this only gives strength to the hadith. This only gives strength to the hadith. Not as some may claim that he somewhat fell into ittirab, he was somewhat confused about the matter, or fell into errors regarding the matter. So for Ibn Hazm, that is to prove, give more strength to the hadith, that the hadith is narrated by both Fatima, and also the hadith goes back to also Aisha. So overall, concerning that, this is the hadith that have been mentioned. So they mentioned that, so the second, and they mentioned regarding concerning that Muhammad, this narrator, who's Muhammad ibn Abi Adi, that is mentioned that he was thiqa, hafiz, ma'mun, that a person was said to be thiqa. So the ulama all him to be thiqat, but so we have that discussion regarding, but as I mentioned that, did he make an error or not? Then that's the area of discussion between the ulama as we had cited, by way of that, the isnad. The next of what is discussed regarding the hadith, by way of the matan. So we have discussed the isnad, and then we have the matan. So by this, the ikhtilaf, the difference regarding the matan of the hadith, regarding the wording of the hadith, that they mentioned regarding concerning this wording of the hadith, that where he states regarding, that it mentioned regarding, inna dam hayd, that the menstrual blood, dam aswad, it is aswad yuraf. So that part, dam aswad yuraf, that the ulama mentioned aswad, that they mentioned regarding concern that part regarding that mention aswad yuraf, that part of the hadith, you have some discussion regarding that most narration does not mention this. So the other narrations, so they mentioned that this part is of the hadith. Is it a part of the hadith where it kind of somewhat goes back to, they said that where a tamyiz, so from this hadith kind of somewhat indicate that a woman that she used tamyiz to kind of somewhat to identify, to see which of whichever that by way of tamyiz, that she can make a distinction between dam al-hayd wa dam al-istihadah by way of the color. But it said no, this word in aswad yu'raf, it is discussed regarding, is this actually a part of the hadith or not? Where they mentioned regarding this, not most of the narration that indicate going back to ada, not to the color of the blood. So they mentioned that the narration of Imam Bukhari and also Imam Muslim of the same hadith of Fatima bint Abu Hubaish, where she mentioned Rasulullah, inni la athhar, that she mentioned I don't go pure. Fa'ada as-salat, should I leave away my salat? Faqal Rasulullah عليه وسلم, the Prophet عليه السلام, he mentioned regarding إنما ذلك العرق, that this is just like a blood that has been broken. فليس بحيضة, and this what you're experiencing, this blood that you're experiencing is not hayd. Then he mentioned فإذا أقبلت الحيض, then he mentioned that if it's your menstruation cycle, al-haida, fatraki as-salat, then you should leave the salah. So then he mentioned فإذا ذهب قدرها, then if it has passed your time, faksili anki ad-dam wa salli. Then he mentioned that if your time that you know your ada has passed, the day that you normally sit out when you're in your cycle, then when that time has passed, then you should perform ghusl and pray and wash away the blood and perform al-ghusl. So they mentioned that hadith that is mentioned in the books of Sahih. It is more authentic, where it doesn't mention about a distinction using, as I mentioned, aswad, the dam aswad, that menstrual blood is aswad yuraf. So with this, the ulama mentioned that that area is a bit we find that Muhammad ibn Amr, one of the narrators, so Muhammad ibn Amr is the only one who mentioned this wording. So from all the other narrators, that is the one who mentioned, as stated, dam aswad yuraf. So Muhammad ibn Amr, that they mentioned in Farada, that is the only one who have said this. So some of the ulama kind of somewhat put a question sign regarding that statement that is mentioned there. So as they mentioned that majority, that so they mentioned that, and that's the reason why they state Ibn Hajar when he stated concerning wastankarahu Abu Hatim, because of these factors, that Abu Hatim, that he can somewhat ankar, mentions that an error has occurred. Munkar meaning that some error have occurred where wordings were mentioned that is not correct. Then also you find that in Nasahi, that when he mentioned this particular hadith, then he mentioned قال النسائي بعد سياق الحديث قال فقد روى هذا حديث, that is hadith had been narrated غير واحد, and many, لم يذكر أحد منهم, and none of them have mentioned from these have mentioned in this hadith ما ذكره ابن أبي Adi, what have been mentioned by Ibn Abi Adi regarding concerning. So based upon this, that An-Nasahi somewhat also was somewhat mindful of certain things in the hadith. So with that being said, as we mentioned, hadith have some discussion around it, in conclusion regarding this particular hadith, that the ulama, as they are grading of this hadith, they're passing their judgment on the hadith regarding the hadith being authentic or not. It is stated that of the ulama who authenticate the hadith. So with this, that of the ulama who have authenticated the hadith, amongst the ulama who authenticate the hadith, Ibn Hibban in his Sahih, Al-Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak, where فَقَدْ سَحَهُ, that with the extent where he mentioned ala shawt Muslim, where Al-Hakim, that he have mentioned the hadith upon the condition of Imam Muslim, that they mentioned that Al-Dhahabi sakata an, where Al-Dhahabi, that he made a summary of the book of Al-Hakim, and he remained silent, didn't say, pass a judgment on the hadith. They mentioned sakata anhu. The Dhahabi, in his Muqtasar Talkhis of Mustadrak, him being silent upon a hadith, then it doesn't necessarily mean that he authenticated a hadith, as some people sometimes believe. So Al-Hakim, by not passing a judgment or sakata anhu, it doesn't necessitate that he's authenticating a hadith. So, but some may take the meaning of him being quiet on the hadith, being silent on the hadith, then this indicate that he's in agreement with Al-Hakim, and that is not the case. Then also they mentioned Ibn Hazm authenticated hadith in his book Ibn Hazm authenticated hadith, as he discussed the hadith in Muhalla, and also An-Nawawi have also authenticated hadith. So An-Nawawi in his book Al-Khulasa, also and Al-Majmu', that he authenticated the hadith. Shaykh Albani of the ulama of contemporaries, alayhim rahmatullahi ta'ala, that I've mentioned regarding concerning that Albani, mentioned concerning that ta'aqqab Shaykh Albani al-Dhahabi, that Albani can somewhat ta'aqqab, can somewhat criticize Al-Hakim regarding his judgment, where he mentioned regarding that, that Al-Hakim state the hadith is of the condition of Imam Muslim, that the hadith is in line with the condition of Imam Muslim, where Albani mentioned that that's not the case. That's not the case, that the hadith hasn't reached that level of authenticity where it is in line with the hadith inside Muslim by way of authenticity. But I mentioned that based upon, he mentioned fihi ibn Amr, fihi Muhammad ibn Amr, and he sons wa ibn Al-Qama, and he's somewhat on the discussion. He's on the discussion where even and also that his hadith are not mentioned as he's not mentioned as a main narrator inside Bukhari. He's not mentioned, and also inside Muslim. His hadith are found in Bukhari and Muslim, but not one of the main narrators, not one of the main narrators. So he mentioned makrunan li ghayri, or bi ghayri. So he's mentioned as makrun. He's mentioned with others inside Bukhari, and also in the mutabat outside Muslim. So these are not the main narrators in those two books. So he mentioned, so Shaykh Albani, alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, that he passed the judgment that hadith is Hasan, Rutbatul Hasan, that hadith to the extent of it is authentic to the level of the hadith being Hasan. So that's concerning the judgment of the ulama on this matter. And of the ulama, they mentioned that Abu Hatim yastankar, that had some objection toward the hadith, that and also others, that Ibn Qattan, that also are others who somewhat criticize the hadith. But overall, that's concerning what has been mentioned regarding the ulama on this hadith. So they mentioned that Muhammad ibn Amr, that Al-Hafid ibn Hajar in his book At-Taqrib, he mentioned Suluq lahu awham. But discussion, but overall, that's what has been mentioned regarding the ulama of this hadith. So the sanad, there's some discussion, the chain, and also the matan, there's some discussion regarding the hadith. Then we give the overall judgment of the ulama of the hadith. Then they mention regarding concerning that of the Sahabiya that is mentioned in this hadith, that they mentioned that is Fatima bint Hubaish. So that is Fatima bint Abi Hubaish ibn Muttalib ibn Asad Al-Qurashiyya Al-Asadiyya. So we have Fatima bint Abi Hubaish ibn Muttalib ibn Asad ibn Abdul Uzza Al-Qurashiyya Al-Asadiyya. And her father is Abi Hubaish, that he was Qais ibn Muttalib, who's Qais ibn Al-Muttalib. And of those that I mentioned, she's famous regarding this hadith. She's famous regarding of this particular hadith regarding Al-Istihadah. And also that they mentioned that she was married to Abdullah ibn Jahsh. She was married to Abdullah ibn Jahsh, and they had, between them, they had a child, one of the, a son, who's Muhammad ibn Abdullah, Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Jash. Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Jash. They mentioned the hadith can be found in Abu Dawood, Nasa'i. So a hadith can be found in Abu Dawood and Nasa'i. So as for the hadith that has been mentioned here, that what have been mentioned regarding the hadith, they mentioned that of the word of hadith mentioned, Inna Fatima bint Hubaish, regarding concerning that Fatima bint Hubayt tustahad. So the mention regarding concerning tustahad, meaning concerning tusibuha hayd kathir, that she was experiencing lots of menstrual discharge. So she have a menstrual discharge was somewhat a lot. So having this a lot. Then they mentioned regarding concern al-hayd, regarding having menstrual discharge, istihadah. So as for istihadah, so they mentioned istihadah, that by way of istimrar, khuruj, ad-dam al-mar, kulli waqt, or akthar, that a woman having continuous or discharge after discharge regular. So having regular, long menstrual, long discharge, blood discharge. So a woman having discharge by way of blood, and this goes all the time, continuous. So, or it goes for a long period. It goes for a long period. So istihadah is a woman having a form of blood discharge, and this occur a lot. This occur a lot and go for a long time. So as for istihadah, then they mentioned as for istihadah, it could cause by various reasons. But so the hadith also it mentioned regarding dam aswad, regarding concerning that al-hayd, dam aswad, that give concern a description of dam al-aswad. So it mentioned it is dark in color. And in the previous session, we had mentioned regarding some distinction between al-istihadah, dam al-istihadah, or dam al-hayd. That of the things that distinguish both by way of the color, that one darker in color, thicker, which is, and also the other is somewhat, it have a raha, regarding concerning that the odor. So these are ways of making a distinction. By way of the color, by way of the smell, the odor, also the thickness or thinness. So these things are of the way to distinguish between both. So regarding concerning the hadith, the Prophet is going to somewhat instructor regarding concerning the hadith, that he mentioned that as he states in the hadith, that فَإِذَا كَانَ ذَلِكَ, then if it is al-hayd, فَإِذَا كَانَ ذَلِكَ يعني al-hayd, ذَلِكَ يرجع إلى الحيض فَأَمْسِكِي عن الصلاة, then you should avoid or stop praying. So it shows regarding concern, so it shows regarding an in Sahihain, the narration of that mentioned, فَتْرَكِي as-salat, fatraki as-salat, then you should abandon your salat, you should not pray. So it shows regarding that, for a woman who is experiencing menstrual discharge, then she does not pray. So certain things that apply to her, which is in this hadith, then of those things that she does not pray, if it's time during fasting, she does not fast. So the woman who is going through al-hayd or menstrual discharge, or menstrual cycle, then she should not pray. She avoid the salah. Then they mentioned that, and they mentioned فَإِذَا كَانَ آخر, if it is not menstrual discharge, istihadah, some other type of blood, غير أسود, غير al-hayd, they mention, so if it is of a different color, could be reddish, could be a little bit browned, and the like, that they mention إِنَّمَا هُوَ حِرْق, that is some kind of form of, that is a blood vessel that has been broken. So they mentioned that for this, in this case, then as he stated, فَاغْسِلِي وَتَوَضِّي, then wash the area and make wudu and pray, and to pray. So that's concerning the difference between both. So with istihadah, the woman still prays if she's still having that discharge of this blood discharge, then she still pray. With hayd, she does not pray. With istihadah, she can fast. With dam al-hayd, she does not fast. So both carry different ones. The woman who's going through al-hayd, then there's no intimacy. The woman that is in istihadah, then she can have intimacy. So these are the ahkam that applies to it. And as we have stated before, that many ahkam revolves around hayd or istihadah. So istihadah as if she's still in a state of cleanliness. She's still in a state of Tahara, so she functions as such. So that's concerning the hadith that have been mentioned and what can be the general meaning of the hadith. Then as for what can be discussed regarding the ahkam of the hadith, then the ulama mentioned regarding concerning this hadith that they mentioned with this narration regarding that they state هذا hadith دليل على أن استحاضة التي زادت دمها وكثرت أنها تنظر في الدم. So we're going to the woman who have istihadah, that continuous blood discharge. She's having this extra additional discharge of blood. Then I mentioned that what is for her to be done if she can somewhat one, that if she that having this and it is a lot, then as for her that they mention, and ishtaba alayha adam, when also she can make a distinction. So she can somewhat having this additional extra discharge of blood, and she's unable to make that distinction. Of the ulama who apply that this hadith is more so, this hadith is for a woman that in her that just started having her cycle. So for the beginner in having her menstrual cycle, that that's the hadith, it applies for her. This hadith applies more so for a woman or the person who's going through the early stage of having menstrual cycle, but also istihadah. So for her, she's unable to make that difference because she's new to this matter. They mentioned that. So as for this case, they mentioned that if she's having that doubt as to what is it? Is it hayd as finish, or is it istihadah? She's still having prolonged discharge of blood. Then they mentioned that that a way to make a distinction regarding the hayd and others, to use the color. So to make a distinction with the color. So the hayd, menstrual or cycle, the blood would be more darker compared to that of istihadah. And also the other thing that we mentioned, also the smell. So for a person who's the beginner new, then they make a distinction with you using the color as a way to draw the difference. And that is mentioned by, yes, that this hadith applies to such cases. This hadith applies to spaces in the beginner stages. So that's concerning that matter. So after the thing also that is discussed regarding concerning the hadith, they mentioned that if a woman who has an ada, a woman of a regular cycle, so they mentioned this hadith applies to the one who's new, they'll use as a way to make a distinction regarding for their menstrual cycle and istihadah, they still having an extra discharge, blood discharge, then they can somewhat compare both bloods. The one that is darker, that's their hayd. The one that is lighter, then that would be istihadah. That's for the one who's a beginner. As for the next case, they mentioned that a woman who have a normal cycle, so she has a normal cycle, come at a set time, so that is normal for her, having a normal cycle, that she can, and she knows the cycle, and it's routine. And it's but then suddenly things change. She starts to have extra bleeding. So normally she have a 5-day cycle, 6-day cycle, then after a while it starts to extend. So her cycle now starts to end, but she have a normal cycle. But then she sees some extension in blood, continuous blood flow. So in this case, that regarding istihadah, they mentioned that in this case, for her to make a distinction regarding her hayd and istihadah, for the one with a normal, regular discharge, menstrual cycle, أنها ترجع إلى عادة ولا تنظر إلى تمييز. So the one who has a normal cycle, a 5-day cycle, but then also she knows it is still continuing after her normal 5 days, then she does use her normal ada, her normal routine that she has regarding her menstrual cycle, go with that. Whatever exceeds that, whatever is addition to that, then it is counted as istihadah. So her 5 days will be counted, her 6th day will be marked. When the 6th day come to an end, that's her normal cycle, then whatever comes after then that's counted as istihadah, because she has an ada. So the ulama mentioned that she used her ada as the deciding factor. So the deciding factor for her would be her ada, not the distinction regarding the difference in color. So that's concerning, that's the call that is taken by Imam Ahmed, and also call Al-Hanafiyyah, and wedge fi madhab Al-Shafi'iyyah. So they mentioned regarding, and they said that as the evidence, the use of the other narration of the hadith, that it mentioned regarding the hadith of Fatima, that we had mentioned before in the Bukhari, where the Prophet ﷺ and other the Prophet ﷺ, إِذَا أَقْبَلَتْ حَيْذَا فَاتْرُكِي الصَّلَاةِ. Where the Prophet mentioned that إِذَا أَقْبَلَتْ, that when their cycle appears, the height it appears, it is present, they mention فَاتْرُكِي الصَّلَاةِ, then leave away your salat. So she have a regular cycle. So when that cycle appear, a regular time cycle, the time of that month appears, then when it comes, leave away the salat, because now it is present. Then I mentioned فَإِذَا ذَهَبَتْ, when it ends, قَدَرَهَا, its normal ada, is normal set of time, فَاغْسِلِي, then I mentioned فَاغْسِلِي أَنْكِ أَدَمْ, wash away the dam, تُصَامَ الْغُسُلْ وَصَلِّي, and make the salat. So I mentioned the woman in that case that she have a normal cycle. She has a normal cycle. So whatever comes beyond this mention, qadriha, whatever is her normal routine or normal cycle, length of time, you stick to this as being your ada. Anything addition to this, then it is taken as istihadah. So that's the call of the ulama who take off this, so that you can sometimes use the ada, as in the hadith, and somewhat is use the ada as the main reference. Not the main reference is making a distinction regarding the smell or the look, not to use, as they refer to as tamyiz. So tamyiz, when you make a distinction by way of the odor or by way of the color. Then I mentioned the qawl al-thani of the ulama who take the position أنها تعمل بالتمييز. Of those who mentioned she can use tamyiz, if that she go back and use a reference to make a decision as to when her cycle would come to an end by way of tamyiz. So which is tamyiz, that and she will not use her normal ada, not use her normal set time of having her cycle, or normal routine, or normal days of her cycle. So she'll use instead tamyiz, and not her ada or set days of her cycle. And they use this hadith. So they use the hadith of the hadith of this bab, the hadith of Aisha, as being as their evidence. So you have that aqwal between ulama regarding the woman who, and of those who take this opinion, they mention it's the qawl is mashhur min madhab al-Malik wa Shafi'iyyah. So that's the more established views, known view more of the Maliki and the Shafi'iyyah. So they mention that in this case, that the author Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan mentioned وَالْقَوْلُ بِالرُّجُوعِ إِلَى الْعَادَةِ أَرْجَحُ, that he take the position that what is more of the correct view and the correct approach is that the woman uses, in this case, was an ada, but things have somewhat changed, that was still of an ada, that she used her ada, not tamyiz. So tamyiz is used for the one who's new in having her cycle. The ada, that the woman stick to her regular days of her cycle, when if she already have an established cycle, she use this as her reference and not tamyiz. Based upon a hadith, as we said in the Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, the hadith of Fatima, فَإِذَا أَقْبَلَتْ الْحَيْضَ فَاتْرُكِي الصَّلَاةِ فَإِذَا ذَهَبَ قَدَرِهَا فَاغْسِلُوا أو فَاغْسِلِي أَنْكِ الدَّمْ وَصَلِّي الحديث. So as we mentioned, this hadith also make a distinction regarding dam al-hayd wa dam al-istihadah, and we have somewhat mentioned those points in the previous session. So we mentioned those points in the previous session. Also of those points that we can add to this discussion, that for women, regarding concern we discussed concerning that the most at what age is the least she will start seeing a cycle, at what age a woman starts seeing a cycle, and also what age that she would end her cycle. So of those things, the ulama also discussed concerning aqal hayd wa akthar. What's the least amount of days a woman might have her cycle, and the longest it might go. So what length of time, how many days, or how long it might go regarding a cycle. So on this matter regarding the length of time as to how a cycle, menstrual cycle might last, then the ulama, they have a khilaf regarding and how long they will be like in a state of purity in between a cycle. On this matter you find a khilaf between the ulama. So in An-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, that he mentioned in his book Sharh Muhaddib, أجمع العلماء, that ulama in agreement, على أن أكثر طهر, that the most length regarding a woman with stain of purity, لا حد له, that it has no fixed time. It has no had. It has no time that one can put to it. Then also that so you have that matter regarding a khilaf between that matter regarding point that they agree upon, that tuhur, that tuhur, there's no set amount of days or time that it may last. Then the ulama discuss concerning that the matter regarding concerning that Imam Malik regarding al-hayd, how long it might go, and the shortest, that how long a period it might go for that Imam Malik, that have state aqal hayd, that the least amount of days al-hayd, daf'atun wahid. It further staff does one flow. So that's one go. So one flow, maybe for Ummah, that would be the least. Then I mentioned that, and other than this, you have to ask, but still have a khilaf between the ulama. Of the ulama who take the position that aqal hayd, yawm wa layla, that the least amount of days or time for a menstrual cycle it will last. So how long it will last? I mentioned al-Malik, one go. One of the ulama